I'm a local lawyer here in Atlanta and a friend of Jared's and charter subscriber to the American Renaissance, and have offered to help a little bit in terms of local arrangements and welcoming all of you all to our state of Georgia and our capital city of Atlanta, a city which has changed very much during my lifetime since I was born here, and not changed altogether for the good, as I'm sure many of you are aware. But we are still proud of our state and of our capital, and I hope that you will have an enjoyable visit and stay here. If there's anything that I can do, if you need any kind of local directions, just ask me and I'll be glad to try to help if I can. This is the first American Renaissance Conference. I hope it'll be one of many. We certainly thank all of you for having partied with your money and come this long distance to attend this conference. And I think it will be one that you will find has been well worth the investment of time and money, and which we hope will be productive of great things for our nation in the years to come. It now is my very distinct honor and privilege to introduce the editor of American Renaissance and the organizer of our conference, Samuel Jared Taylor. And he has asked me to let you all know that Samuel Taylor and Jared Taylor are one and the same person. And he is the identical person, Samuel Jared Taylor. Mr. Taylor brings to our cause a background that is rich in achievements and education. He comes from a family that has been prominent in the history of our country. He is a descendant of General William Robertson Boggs, who was one of the Confederate generals. His father is a highly respected Presbyterian clergyman, the Reverend Archibald Taylor, who was also a missionary to Japan. Ironically enough, my father is also a Presbyterian clergyman, and when I was a child, his secretary and sort of my nanny was a woman named Molly Moore. And when I met Jared, I discovered that he had known Molly in Japan, where she also sort of took charge of him, the way she had taken charge of me when she worked in our parish here in Atlanta. So it's a small world. But anyway, Jared was born in Kobe, Japan, while his parents were in Japan as Presbyterian missionaries. He was schooled until the age of 12 in Japanese schools. He is one of the few white people who can speak Japanese faultlessly and can pass on the telephone as a Japanese. After age 12, he went to an English language school in Japan, and then at the age of 16 was admitted into one of our finest educational institutions, Yale University. He got a BA at Yale, and then went on to Paris, where he got an MA in the Paris Institute of Political Studies. He is the author of 3 highly acclaimed books: Shadows of the Rising Sun on Japan, The Tyranny of the New, which is available unfortunately only in Japanese, and Paved with Good Intentions. He also is the founder of the American Renaissance newsletter, and he and his wife Evelyn have one child, Charlotte. It gives me great pleasure to introduce someone who has sacrificed a great deal for a cause that I believe in, and which I think most of you believe in, and to welcome to the podium Samuel Jared Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Dixon. Well, welcome. Welcome all of you to Atlanta and to the American Renaissance Conference. This, of course, doesn't really have to be said, but I'll say it anyway. Without you, we couldn't be here. And I'm especially grateful for those of you who came long distances. Some of you have come from foreign countries. Believe it or not, we have in attendance people from France, some from Canada, and we have some people from places that might as well be foreign countries, California, and even Alaska.
New York City.
Oh yeah, New York City. And of course, we're here to talk about some very serious questions, problems that face our nation and our culture and our race. But we're also here to make new friends, to renew old acquaintances, and I hope that while you're here, you'll have an opportunity to enjoy the fellowship of people who think the same way about some of the important issues that our country faces. And there are several gentlemen here who are from Atlanta who would be happy to answer any questions you have about the city, about the conference. If some of you people may not know anyone at all in this room. And so please feel free to introduce yourself to Martin O'Toole, Mike Broadwell. Those are the men who were working at the registration desk, Sam Dixon, who you just met. And please feel free also to introduce yourself to the speakers. If you've always wanted to meet Larry Oster, well, now's your chance. Same Ronald Tiselli. And also, I might ask you, while the conference is going on, to please wear your name tags as kind of an ID. We don't want just anybody wandering in and out, and so I ask you to keep these on. Also, one thing that I'd like to point out, the session begins tomorrow at 8:30, and we have a full lineup of absolutely top-notch speakers, and we'd like to give every one of them a chance to say all the things that he's prepared to say. And so I hope very much that we can start this conference on time and move along in a timely sort of way. In fact, my original plan was to make a few welcoming remarks this evening and then break for a cocktail reception. But because we ended up having so many people with so many good things to say, that as it happens, I will give my remarks this evening, and then we will break later for the reception. And since I suspect by then all of you will be more inclined to have a drink than to ask questions, and since I'll be up at the podium practically all day tomorrow, and you can bombard me with every question you wish, probably after I speak, we can just move out and go to the reception. Well, the name of my talk was If We Do Nothing. And the question, of course, is, what will happen? What will happen to our country if we, the majority population, Anglo-Americans and European Americans, do nothing about the current trends at work in our nation today? What will happen if these trends follow themselves out to their ultimate fateful conclusions? Well, one of the most important and obvious, of course, is that our population will change. There are two relentless processes going on that will have profound effects on this country. One, of course, is immigration. The fact that we import 1 million people a year approximately, 90% of whom are non-white. The other is this phenomenon known as differential birth rates. And the fact that if you take just black people, for example, they are out-reproducing white people at such a rate that even if there were no immigration at all, blacks would outnumber whites in about 150, 160 years. So, the demographers tell us that if nothing is done in the next several decades, by the year maybe 2030, 2040, nobody's entirely sure exactly when this fateful day will come, whites will be reduced to a minority in the United States. And of course, we are to look upon this as a wonderful thing, a great blossoming of diversity and cultural enrichment. Well, I think that many white people in their hearts know that this would not be a wonderful thing, this would be a terrible thing. And all we need to do to know what kind of America we will eventually be living in if we do nothing, is to take a look around. Just take a look in South Central Los Angeles. Take a look in Camden, New Jersey. Take a look in Miami. All of these places, bit by bit, the United States are places where the white population has increasingly been displaced by non-whites, blacks, Hispanics, and although it's not something that one says with any joy, but something that one is compelled to say, as the population changes, as a neighborhood, a city, a county, a nation becomes increasingly non-white, it becomes a place where white people do not feel they can decently live. This means that in our country, there are already hundreds of square miles, thousands of square miles, in which the white population no longer lives, no longer dares set foot, in which all of you are essentially unwelcome. These are all areas that, for all practical purposes, have been lost to Western civilization. And in fact, it's really all that's required to know what the future of America, for essentially all of America, will be like, is to read your local newspaper. Our newspapers are increasingly full of stories about crime, about poverty, about declining educational standards, about strange exotic diseases from the tropics that we thought we'd wiped out. These stories are ostensibly about the United States of America, but by and large, these are stories that are in fact about race. Let me just give you one aspect of what life is likely to be like as our population changes, if we in fact permit it to change. And that's just a simple matter of crime rates. In the United States today, blacks commit violent crime at about 10 times the rate of whites, 10 to 12 times the rate. What this means, and though everyone senses this, no one is prepared to say it, what this means is that if a neighborhood changes from all white to, say, half black, ineluctably the crime rate rises essentially by 5 or 6-fold. By changing the population in that fashion, you get a 500 or 600% increase in violent crime. The same is true, by and large, with Hispanics. Hispanics commit violent crimes at a rate of perhaps 5 to 6 times the rate of whites. They're not as violent as blacks, but they're considerably more violent than whites. By the same token, as the population changes, it increases in criminal violence. One more detail about the effects that population change have on a municipality or ultimately the United States of America. I don't know if you've all been following in the news the fact that Chicago has been having a terrible time. They've discovered that tons of mail have disappeared. They've been found burned to a crisp under overpasses. They've found thousands of pounds in the backyards of mail carriers, just dumped in garbage heaps. Well, as our newspapers wring our hands over this catastrophic breakdown in the U.S. postal system, it comes out, it transpires that in Chicago, the postal system is made up 80% of black employees. Well, this, naturally, we're led to believe, is the merest of coincidences. But, of course, it is not. And let me be, in fact, perhaps brutal in saying so. When I learned the figure of 80%, I was astonished that Chicago has any mail delivery at all. And I believe that the reason mail continues to be delivered in Chicago is because Chicago is still nevertheless embedded in an infrastructure, in a nation with expectations that are still largely formed by the European American majority. Now, this is unfortunately just one more example of what happens when any part of the country becomes non-white, specifically black. As our country becomes as our population becomes a third world population, we will ineluctably become a third world country. And this problem of mail delivery in Chicago is simply one example. Another example I could give you is the problem of infrastructure in New York City. New York City was built with a very complex network of bridges, overpasses, underpasses, all built, let's face it, by white people in the expectation that they would be maintained and supported and used by yet more generations of white people with the same expectations about maintenance and how something should be supported for years and years of continuous use. Well, New York City now, whites are a minority, and so New York City must suffer under the burden that any city in the United States has in which whites have become a minority. One of the things that has been set aside, of course, is this kind of planning for the future, maintenance of bridges, and the bridges, of course, are beginning to fall down. Now, it seems to me one could not ask for a more eloquent demonstration of our degeneration than the fact that this generation of Americans does not have the wit and the resources merely to maintain a structure that previous generations had the wit and the resources to build. I think that's a very, very clear indication of the kind of decline we have suffered and the kind of decline we can anticipate. What else? As the United States becomes more of a third world country, we will have more third world diseases. Already we have tuberculosis of a kind that does not respond to drugs. Tuberculosis was a disease we thought we'd eliminated in this country. AIDS has been part of the problem in increasing tuberculosis, but another has been immigration. Tuberculosis comes in the lungs of immigrants and stays. We have about 6,000 lepers in the United States. 90% of them immigrated to this country. As our population changes, our health standards will change. And it makes one wonder, which will be the first American city in which it becomes impossible to drink the water? The same will, of course, be true for administration of justice. In many Latin American countries, police must be bribed, judges must be bribed. The assumption that you'll get a fair shake from the criminal justice system, which is not always an assumption that we can count on today, will increasingly become utterly far-fetched. And finally, we all take for granted that in the United States we have fair elections. You go to the voting booth and nobody is going to pretend that you voted for someone else. Well, these things are changing too. Recently there was a congressional election in the city of, in the Philadelphia area. And there was such massive voter fraud that a judge ordered that the election be redone, a brand new election to choose this congressman, because, as it turned out, this overwhelmingly Hispanic district had engaged in massive voter fraud in the form of absentee ballots. Once again, the newspapers would have us believe that the fact that it was a Hispanic district was yet again just a coincidence. I'm afraid it's not just a coincidence. Ultimately, I think what we can expect, if we do nothing, is that the United States will increasingly become like Brazil. Brazil has a minority white population, and it lives in a kind of heavily guarded sort of enclave surrounded by a sort of endemic form of low-grade barbarism. That is the direction in which we are moving, with one additional factor. Unlike in the case of Brazil, many of the blacks living in the United States and many immigrants to this country hate us. Liberalism teaches them to blame us, the white majority population, for all of their shortcomings and all of their failures. This is, of course, one of the reasons why they belittle our heroes and rewrite our history and tear down our monuments. Some of you may or may not be aware of the fact that in San Antonio, the home of the Alamo, there's a very strong movement afoot now to tear down the statues of the men who defended the Alamo. Well, when you think about it, this is not such a strange, not such an incomprehensible thing. San Antonio is now majority Hispanic. What were those men doing who defended the Alamo? They were killing Mexicans. They were killing Hispanics. The curious thing is not that they want to tear the monument down. The curious thing, of course, is that that city is now majority Hispanic. That is a phenomenon that requires explanation. Likewise, in the case of the city of Miami, Miami just repudiated English as the official language of the city. Why? Well, Miami is one of the most startling examples of dispossession of European Americans on the entire continent. In 1960, the population of Miami was 90% white. In just 30 years, the population of Miami became 10% white. That is a catastrophic change. And that, too, is another part of the United States that is lost to the kind of America that used to be and the kind of America that we would wish to live in. Of course, these are a kind of formal, legalistic expression of contempt for America. Tearing down monuments, changing the names of schools, repudiating English as the official language. And many non-whites, they express their contempt, even their hatred for the United States and for the majority population in more private and even intimate ways. For example, more than half of the violent crime committed by blacks is committed against whites. There is, in fact, more black on white violent crime than there is black on black crime. This is not something, of course, that is of any interest to the newspapers, which are concerned with black on black crime. And this ratio of more than 50% of the violent crime committed against whites, it's important to contrast that with the fact that when whites commit violent crimes, They target blacks only 2% of the time. Now, if blacks are in fact targeting whites more than half the time, how much of that has to do not simply with targets of opportunity, but the expression of genuine racial animus and hatred? I don't know how much, but I'm sure that part of it has to do with the contempt and hatred that they feel for us. Now, what about Hispanic crime against whites? Interestingly enough, there's no proper way to find out. Our country keeps crime statistics for Hispanics merely as a victim category. They are not a perpetrator category. And for that reason, if a Hispanic, if a Mexican American attacks a black and says, "You nigger," and this becomes categorized as a hate crime, it's a hate crime committed by a white against a black. On the contrary, if a white person, of course, were to attack a Hispanic and say, "You damn spick," and this becomes a hate crime, that is a hate crime committed by a white against a Hispanic, because Hispanics are strictly a victim category, never a perpetrator category. I think, as an aside, it's always interested me that the 4 police officers who beat Rodney King were consistently described as all white. Well, one was Hispanic. Of course, if Rodney King had been Hispanic, we would have all known that he was Hispanic. Therefore, Hispanics are a victim category, not a perpetrator category. Now, another thing to think about when contemplating how the United States population may change is to simply be aware of the phenomena we permit and even encourage while whites are in fact still a majority. You all know, of course, about affirmative action. Despite the fact we are still a majority, we've passed laws that require racial discrimination against whites. I thought that affirmative action had gone just about as far as it was likely to go until just this last February. I discovered that the city of Los Angeles, when it opened up its examinations for people who wished to be firefighters in the city, it simply told whites they couldn't take the exam. They turned away thousands of whites. The problem, of course, was they were under great pressure to have blacks and Hispanics on the firefighting squad, and white people had this awkward, nasty habit of getting the best scores. Well, what do you do about that? Of course, many municipalities have spent millions and millions of dollars trying to come up with tests on which whites somehow do not get the best scores, but those tricky white people always fool them. The only solution, therefore, was simply to tell white people they couldn't even take the examination. Now, did this result in any kind of headlines or hue and cry, or, dare I mention it, rioting? Of course not. In any case, as you all probably know, the House of Representatives has just passed a bill. The Senate had better sense than to do this, but the House of Representatives just passed a different kind of affirmative action law in which executions of criminals would be on the basis of quota, and that one could not execute blacks unless one had executed a sufficient number of whites already. Now, there are already school districts in this country in which discipline must be doled out on a racial quota basis. You cannot suspend another black person until you have suspended X number of whites, etc., etc. Everything, of course, according to quota. And in fact, a professor of criminology at Yale has taken this to its logical extreme. He has pointed out that when it comes to determining employment discrimination, all one needs to do is find a statistical disparity. If the surrounding population is 30% black, but blacks are only 10% of the truck drivers, etc., that is prima facie evidence of discrimination, and an employer can be taken to court and made to hire blacks and made to pay compensation to those who presumably did not hire because he was a racist, not because they couldn't drive the trucks. Well, taken to its obvious logical extreme, this professor at Yale, this black professor, says we must have imprisonment by quota. In other words, unless we imprisoned a sufficient number of whites for this week or this year or for this city, we couldn't imprison any more blacks. Now, remember, all of these proposals, all of these laws, all of these practices are nevertheless in a nation in which we are still a majority. Let us imagine what sorts of laws are likely to be passed by a Congress of the United Third World States, if in fact there still is a Congress, in which whites are a dwindling remnant. What sort of laws will a Supreme Court be happy to ratify as constitutional once there are only 1 or 2 white Supreme Court justices? It's not difficult to imagine higher income tax brackets for whites, exclusion from certain professions, or even confiscation of property above a certain amount. I mean, is any of this really that much different from telling white people they cannot take an exam for firefighter? I think it's not at all difficult to imagine even more egregious measures taken against whites, which of course can always be justified in terms of atonement for the past sins of which we are constantly being reminded. So, what is it that we must do? I'd like to paraphrase a letter from it's a letter from a reader of American Renaissance. He sent a letter to the editor not long ago. He's sitting in this room, in fact, but I won't tell you who he is. And in effect, he says, American Renaissance should not dwell on the intellectual deficiencies of blacks. It should not dwell on the cultural deficiencies of Hispanics. What American Renaissance should dwell upon is the lamentable, suicidal deficiencies of whites. And of course, he's right. Because after all, it is we who have promoted and established an immigration policy that will reduce us to minorities. It is we who lavish Medicaid, welfare, public education on illegal immigrants. Not just aliens, but illegal aliens are entitled to these things. It is we who have established a system of racial discrimination against whites. It is we who have established a welfare system in which the intelligent, responsible, hardworking citizens are taxed and in fact punished to subsidize the proliferation of the irresponsible, incompetent, and unintelligent. It is we who have promoted the notion that somehow for whites it is a virtue to be dispossessed. It is a virtue to walk off the stage of history. So, whose behavior requires explanation? Does the behavior of blacks really require an explanation? No. When blacks see a weakness, they exploit it. It's the natural thing to do. When they find that whites will meekly accept blame for even the most preposterous things, when they see that we will accept the blame for every single one of their failures and shortcomings, what is to stop them from heaping blame upon us? When they find that whites will not even articulate their legitimate racial interests, much less try to defend them, of course they will then promote their own. They will move into that vacuum and promote their interests at the expense of our own. And what this leads to is that increasingly they despise us, because in our weakness and in our cowardice, we are despicable. We are like the fawning dog. The harder you kick it, the harder it wags its tail. Immigrants, what about them? Is their behavior so peculiar? Is their behavior difficult to understand? No. They leave behind societies that are not successful. They wish to come to a society that is clearly more successful than their own. Well, once they get over the shock of discovering that we appear to be perfectly prepared to hand over to them the nation built by our ancestors, once they get over the shock of this, are they going to say no? Of course not. Once they discover that we are prepared to teach their children in their languages, not ours, glorify their traditions at the expense of our own, and to shower them with benefits for which they have not paid, can we expect them to say no? No. Obviously, what they are doing is perfectly natural and understandable, and they too, before long, will learn to despise us, because any people that gives away its birthright is despicable. Therefore, it is we who are the odd, the peculiar, the inexplicable phenomenon. Probably there's not been a case in the history of the world of a dominant majority people that has so willingly given away its culture, its language, its nation, its birthright. And it reminds me, practically every time I read the newspapers, I'm reminded of Vilfredo Pareto's remark, any man who would become a lamb will find wolves to eat him. Well, there are plenty of wolves out there insofar as we wish to become lambs. So, if we are not to be shoved aside, we have to be prepared to act in our own interests, which is, of course, the most natural, normal, and healthy thing in the world. Much we are told otherwise. Every other group naturally does so. They don't think twice about it. It is only whites who worry about whether or not it is proper and moral for them to do what they would naturally wish to do in this respect. Why do we not defend our own interests? And in answering this question, I think there are many ways to approach this question. I'm not fully satisfied that I have the answers to this question, but I will borrow an idea from Professor Levitt, who will be speaking tomorrow morning. He once made an observation to me that every age and every people has its absolute sin. In the medieval Europe, for example, for a woman to have her chastity or her virtue violated was an absolute sin, and a woman was supposed to prefer death rather than commit this absolute sin. Today, in the late 20th century, at least for white people, racism, of course, is an absolute sin. We must do nothing that could conceivably provoke an accusation of racism. Well, when you think about this, if you think about any other group or organization in the world, obviously, unless its members promote their interests first, then that group disappears and is destroyed. If the Democratic Party does not think enough of its principles to put them before those of another group, what will happen? It will disappear. If the nation of Japan does not have sense enough to put Japanese interests before those of other countries, if the Japanese people don't have a sense of being a people, have a sense of legitimate interests, Japan will disappear. Well, we, of course, are the same way. Unless we are willing to articulate and defend our legitimate interests, and frankly, to be prepared to put our interests before those of others in as moral and as humane a way as possible, we too will disappear. And what are these legitimate interests of ours? Well, obviously and clearly, the most obvious is not to be swamped. It is our right, it is our duty not to let our country become full of people who are utterly unlike ourselves. Clearly, the United States has no duty whatsoever to look after every incompetent third world tribe that drifts into the United States. And I'd like to make something else clear. It is our duty and it is our right to oppose dispossession by any group unlike ourselves. Let us imagine that this million immigrants coming into our country every year was composed of people smarter than ourselves, harder working, more moral, better looking, superior in every way. It is still our obligation to prevent them because we have the rights to be us, and only we can be us. We have... We have the right to participate in the unfolding of our own culture according to its own particular genius. And no other people has the right to prevent that. We should have the right to do this without the fatal embrace of those who wish to come live amongst us and thereby transform what our ancestors have built and what it is our right to carry forward. But aside from immigration, aside from those who would come to our country and change it, there's something else that we have to do, and that is to declare and act upon other things of vital importance that are equally obvious, just as obvious as our right not to be swamped and displaced. One of these is the fact that different races differ in average intelligence and probably in other abilities as well. This is a subject that's going to be looked into at some length in some of the other talks, and won't go into it in any detail, but so long as we refuse to acknowledge these important differences in average ability, we will continue to be blamed for the inherent failings of others. This is an intolerable situation, and it is absolutely vital that these differences be acknowledged and to some extent acted upon. Something else that we must do, we must acknowledge as frequently and as vociferously as possible that multiculturalism, multiracialism, all of these multis are a failure. They work as well as they do. Our nation continues to stagger on as best it does for only one reason. It's because whites have made one suicidal concession after another. If whites were to defend their legitimate interests with 1/10 the vigor that blacks defend their interests, this nation would be a vastly, vastly different place. And we need to take this a step further and point out that integration has also failed. The data on this 30-year-old experiment, is in. This has been a catastrophe. White people must not be forced to live with, go to school with, work with people not of their own choosing. It is one of the oldest enshrined rights of an Englishman or an American to choose his own associates, the right of free association. And to think that this could have been done away with by legislative action just a few decades ago, that was one of the great defeats for our people. Of course, practically all whites understand this, and that is why they move away. They go to the suburbs. They send their children to private schools, because everyone knows that once the neighborhood, the school, the club turns black or Hispanic or whatever it turns, it's no longer a place where they're comfortable, and no longer a place that is civilized by their lights of what constitutes civilization. And so we do flee, we go away. But this kind of quiet resistance isn't enough. Individuals can flee, but the race and the culture cannot flee. And all of you in your well-heeled suburbs, sending your children to private schools, you're just buying time. And you're not buying very much time. Some of the people in this room will probably spend their entire lives in the shrinking enclave that's still, where Anglo-American civility still reigns. The lucky ones will be able to do that. More and more, hundreds and thousands of square miles of the United States will be cut off to them, but there will be enough for them to lead normal and even happy lives. But the next generation, and the next generation, what is America going to be like for them? Darkness and barbarism are going to fall upon them just as surely as night falls every night. And of course, in all of these respects, it is our government that is our greatest enemy. Our government in a democracy is supposed to reflect ourselves, and to an unfortunate degree, it does reflect us. But in closing, I would like to point out that on 2 occasions on this continent, my ancestors found the government under which they lived so intolerable, so oppressive, so inimical to their own interests, that they were prepared to make war in order to bring this oppression to an end. The first time was in 1776. We won that war. The second time was in 1861. I'm sorry to say, we lost. But I would point out to you that the oppressions and the tyrannies of my ancestors in 1776 and 1861, the oppressions and the tyrannies they felt were nothing compared to the forces of destruction that we ourselves have arrayed against us today. Now, I think if my ancestors of that year were living today, I think I know how they would solve these problems. But times are different. And today's men and women are different. In some respects, I think we are lesser men and women, but we are still men and women. And I do not know how this current system of soft, creeping, intrusive, socialistic dispossession will come to an end. But it will come to an end, or we